What's the scariest 100% true story you've heard of? Story 1. One of my friends' families growing up had a beach house, and I'd get invited every now and then. They had money, and the house was massive, a pretty cool place too. They even had a full-time maid who had her own flat at the back. One day they went there for a long weekend, and when they opened the door, the place had been ransacked. It was a mess, missing TVs, furniture, broken stuff. You get the picture. They went to check on the maid, and her flat was empty. All her belongings were gone. They called the cops who came over, had a brief look, not interested from what they said, and left saying the maid probably had something to do with it. And that's what everyone believed for a week. Until the dad returned the following weekend to try and change the locks and such, and he brought their dogs along with him. Yup, you know it. One of the dogs started digging and found the maid buried in the backyard under a tarp they had close to the pool. So the theory now is that whoever came in probably knew her and she recognized them, so she had to go. Story 2. My high school girlfriend called late one night after I was home and in bed. She said that something had happened and asked if I could come over. She was clearly shaken and not full of details, so I told my parents and drove over toward her house. At the top of her subdivision, I was met by a cop with his lights on. He asked where I was going, and I told him about the call from my girlfriend. He let me go by, and I came over the hill to the cul-de-sac where she lives and saw multiple cop cars around the circle. They watched me pull up and get out of my car. My girlfriend came running out of her house and met me in the street. She explained that someone had broken into her neighbor's house and started beating her with something heavy. The neighbor managed to get out of the house and headed to my girlfriend's home, where she started banging furiously on the front door. My girlfriend's dad was out of town, so her mom answered the door, and the neighbor just fell into the foyer, bleeding profusely from the head. Her mom looked up to see the attacker headed up the walkway toward the front door. She pulled the neighbor into the house and closed the door, hitting the attacker with it before it fully closed. He then took the heavy tool he had used to beat the neighbor and smashed the little window at the top of the door. Her mom started screaming, and the attacker just turned around and walked up the street into the darkness. I spent the night there that night, along with 2 or 3 cops outside in their cars. And in the morning, we could see blood still pooled on the floor in the foyer and splattered above the front door from where the attacker had swung the bloody tool to smash the window. No one was ever caught or even identified. It was just completely random. The neighbor survived and, to my knowledge, had no permanent physical injuries beyond scarring from having her scalp stapled shut. She moved away shortly after the incident. Story 3. I was around 10 years old. I was at school, but my mom told me she was thinking of taking me to the doctor in the afternoon. Recurring eye issue. Lunchtime came, and I was in the dining hall when the office woman told me there was a taxi outside for me, and I needed to go. I assume my mom booked it for me, as she can't drive. I cleared up my stuff and got my bag. Just about to leave when I remembered my jacket in my classroom. I rushed to get it and headed out for the taxi. The office woman told me I was too late and the taxi had gone without me. I just went back to class, panicking that my mom would be angry at me. School finished, and my mom was waiting for me at the gates. I burst into tears, apologizing for missing the taxi and thinking I was in big trouble. She never ordered a taxi and had no clue what I was talking about. She ended up not making the doctor appointment. No one ever found out who ordered the taxi or who the driver was. My mom doesn't like to think what would have happened if I hadn't forgotten my jacket and gotten into that taxi. Story 4. Well, it's my story. When I was a little kid, 5 or 6 maybe, we had this neighbor who was like a grandma to me. I'd go over and have snacks, and she had a Mr. Potato Head I played with that had belonged to her, now adult, son. Weird core memories. He came home in his 20s from the army, I think. I don't remember much about him, but he asked about taking my older brothers camping. My mom said no, she had a weird feeling about him. Side note, we lived out in the country, not even a town, just a place. There were no locked doors. Everyone trusted each other. My mom saw him at our little store with bee stings all over and was concerned. He said he got them at the creek. She thought that was weird because that just wasn't a thing where we went all the time. But okay. A little while later, not sure how long, the news said there was a murder of some campers out past where we lived. No leads, people were shocked. This doesn't happen here. My mom remembered her weird feeling and the bee stings that didn't make sense. She called the police to say, hey, probably nothing, but here's what I know. I remember detectives coming to our house to talk to her. They had some other evidence that matched, but not enough to link him to the murder, a couple with their child. It's unsolved to this day, though the detective said he knew it was him. A few years later, the guy went to prison for an abduction, attempted murder of a woman who had run out of gas and accepted a ride from him. She lived, thank God. Story 5. My grandfather's village was razed by the Nazis. He had 9 siblings. The Nazis came to the village in retribution due to guerrilla attacks, and they believed the guerrillas were hiding there. Most young men fled before they arrived. The men who were in the village were lined up against a wall and shot. My grandfather's mother put half her children, the youngest, in the cellar, and she took the other half with her because the Nazis were rounding up the entire village and locking them inside the church. The reason she split her children was because she feared they would all be killed, so she wanted at least some of them to survive. The Nazis ransacked and burned nearly every house in the village, including my grandfather's. He was in the cellar with his siblings and their house burned above them, but they were saved. Those in the church also survived, but many didn't. After this, the Nazis came again sometime later and pretty much forced all the young men and boys, including my grandfather, to help make roads and fortifications for them. Despite it all, they all survived the war, though many in the family didn't. Story 6. In the 1990s, a nurse in New Jersey killed hundreds of hospital patients. Sometimes he would sneak into patients' rooms at night and inject them with fatal doses of medication. Other times, he would put the medication into IV bags in the supply room, so they would kill whichever random patient they were given to later. He was accused several times. Some patients pointed him out before they died. Some staff thought he was creepy and dangerous and refused to work with him. He kept getting fired from hospitals. But the hospital managers knew that if he got arrested, they would be sued by the families of the patients he murdered. So they just fired him and didn't call the police. That happened at 12 different hospitals over the course of 16 years. Investigators believe he killed as many as 400 people. After he was arrested, he confessed to 40 murders. In 29 of them, he gave enough detail to be charged and plead guilty. He is linked to 300 plus more deaths than that, but details of those will probably never be known because so much information was lost over time or destroyed by the hospitals. Story 7. The Legend of Bearman. So, people think of that one South Park episode with Man, Bear, Pig. No, it's not even close to that. There was this camp I used to go to during the summer. There were probably around 500 kids there for a week straight. Everyone had cabins they would stay in, assigned by gender and age, and each cabin had an older person in charge. The older person was around 17 or 18, watching over 13 to 16-year-olds in the cabins. And then the staff were actual adults who had their own cabins, but they would be on night shift duties to walk around and make sure everyone was staying in their cabins. So now that you kind of know the setting, let's get into the legend. As it goes, in the woods, when all the kids were in the cabins and the lights were out, a bear would come out from the deep woods and wander into the campgrounds. The bear would then stand on its back legs and walk as if it were a human. Then it would choose a cabin, and if you were unlucky, it would go by your bed and watch you sleep. If you made any single move, it would grab you and take you into the woods, never to be seen again. Hearing that scared the crap out of 14-year-old me. It was something the older girl told all of us. A bunch of the other girls were like, "Pfft, it's so we stay quiet and sleep." But other kids from other cabins heard about it too. I never stopped thinking about it, and I would always try to stay as still as possible when I slept. Flash forward a few years later, I ran into one of the staff who used to work at the camp, and I told them about how scared I was of Bearman, but that it was a good trick to get kids to stay quiet. Well, turns out it's actually based on a true story. I guess back in the 80s, a man dressed in a bear costume, which was some sort of mascot for the camp at the time, would take girls out of their cabins. So as you can imagine, to my horror, I was completely bewildered that Bearman actually existed at some point in time. Story 8. A robbery at my place. But it was the way in which it happened. I lived in a basement suite with my younger brother in a quiet neighborhood. The entire front of the house was exposed to the sidewalk, but the sides and back were covered with fences and trees. The only way to see if anyone was in the basement was through this small window in my bedroom that's about 5 feet from my bed. I got word while I was out that my place had been robbed. The robbers went through the basement suite door at the back, kicked it open, and then made their way upstairs after robbing the basement suite. They just so happened to rob the place in a 30-minute window when myself, my brother, and the people upstairs were all out. This means they were watching us for a couple of days and monitoring our patterns. What scared me was not really the robbery, but the image of me sleeping while a robber presses his face against the window, 5 feet away from my bed, just watching me. Story 9. The other night, my wife took our child out for several hours. In that time, I wrapped up work, then left to get dinner around 4:30 p.m. I got home around 6:30, played with our dog, and did a few chores. Then when my wife got home around 7:30, we relaxed a bit, and I headed for bed around 9 p.m. I'm usually up early with our kid. Maybe 2 minutes after crawling into bed, I got a text from my wife with a picture of our dry erase menu board on our fridge. See, usually at the start of the week, my wife will fill out a rough menu for dinners that week. I remembered seeing it earlier in the day, and it was filled out as expected. The picture she sent was of the menu all scrambled up, like the letters were all moved everywhere, with random words and squiggles throughout. Some of it was her writing, but others were incomplete words or rewritten words in handwriting that wasn't hers or mine. This freaked us out, as our 1-year-old certainly didn't do it. The county sheriff showed up and swept the house and found nothing. Nothing was out of place or missing either. He was spooked by it a bit too. He said they never get a call out in the country where we are and recommended we change our locks. We hadn't, as the couple we bought our home from were elderly. So we did that night. Story 10. When I was about 18, my friend and I went to the movies and then decided to walk home. It was a bit of a walk, but we didn't want to pay for a cab. I'm always pretty vigilant when walking, especially at night. So I noticed a guy with his hood up walking behind us. Every so often, I'd look over my shoulder to check on him. He started pretty far behind us, but was gaining ground weirdly quickly. The last time I turned my head, I caught him sprinting at us. I panicked and told my friend to run for it. She was in those Birkenstock slip-on sandals that were popular then, and she was struggling to run, so I was dragging her until we got to a gas station. I banged on the window and begged the clerk to let us in, but he said he couldn't because it was past a certain time at night. He promised if the guy came near us, he'd call the cops. The guy came down the hill through the gas station, staring at us the entire time. I swear the only reason he thought better of it was because the gas clerk had the phone visibly in his hand. Plus, he was a big guy. I completely broke down after he left. Just the thought that he was running at us while I had my back turned scares me so much. What if I hadn't turned when I did that last time? Story 11. One of my many experiences with night terrors or sleep paralysis left me with memory loss. And now I have to live with the fact that my body kinda operated without me for a week. I was about 7 years old and woke in the middle of the night to find this smoke creature crawling up from the bottom of my bed. It was terrifying, as you can imagine, and I booked it for the landing, which is weird because, looking back, I would have expected it to be sleep paralysis. I still get these occurrences often, but I could move perfectly well on this occasion. I reached the top of the stairs outside my bedroom, and another one was slowly making its way up, step by step, out of the darkness of the floor below. I froze and looked around for somewhere else to run to, but I was pinned because the first one was making its way through my bedroom doorway toward me. Both of these smoke demon things were advancing on little 7-year-old me, so I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed the house down. My mom came running just as I started to go blind, with smoke creeping into my vision. Blood pressure was going haywire. It was the same smoke I get when I stand up too fast. Mom ended up soothing me, taking me back to bed, and at some point, she left and let me go back to sleep. The next morning, I apologized for waking her up last night. She had no idea what I meant, and we were both confused. I told her, "I woke you up on the stairs. I was having a nightmare." She informed me that that happened over a week ago, not last night. I have no memory of that week occurring, not a single shred, but apparently I had gone to school every day, played with my friends, eaten my dinner, done my homework, had my baths, all without knowing I had done it. Apparently I'd been kind of quiet during that week, and my mom assumed I was having trouble at school, which wasn't an uncommon experience for me. But I still, to this day, don't remember anything after that night. And it gives me the creeps to imagine that my body has done things, gone through the motions of everyday life, without me having any knowledge of doing it. Story 12. I lived in Mesa, Arizona when I was 10 years old. We lived in a rough area, but I was just a kid, completely ignorant to the dangers of the world. I was walking back home from my friend's house, and my mother wanted me home by 9. I'd always start walking back at around 8:40 to make sure I wasn't late, and it was only a couple of blocks from my house, so it wasn't a super long distance. It was around the time of year when the sun would set at 5:30 and be dark well before 7 p.m., so it was very much nighttime. As I was walking, I heard a woman calling my name. I turned to look and saw it was one of my mom's friends, but she didn't know her too well. I recognized her and won't say a name, but I turned around and said hello and smiled. She walked up to me and told me my mom had called her and asked her to come get me and give me a ride back because something happened at our house. She said it was an emergency and that I needed to go with her and her husband, whom my family was also familiar with. I was only about 5 minutes from my house, but I was told it was an emergency and I agreed to go with her. As I was walking, I got this weird feeling in my gut and this shaking in my legs that I now realize was my instincts being on high alert. I stopped for a minute and asked if we could call my mom, and she said my mother was in the hospital right now and that I needed to hurry. Right as we were opening the door to the car, I heard my mother shout my name as loud as she could. I turned on a dime and quickly walked toward my mom. My mom asked what was going on, and the woman replied that she was just giving me a ride home because she saw me. That was not the story she gave me, so I told my mother what she had said and asked what was happening. My mom just looked at me. She could always tell when I was lying versus telling the truth. The woman went to interrupt me, likely to lie, but my mom cut her off and stared back at her with the most shocked expression ever. These words still send shivers down my spine. She said in the most shocked voice ever, "You were trying to take my son." The husband looked out the window, urging his wife to get in the car, and as I looked back toward him, I saw a syringe on the dashboard leaning against the windshield, which he grabbed right as I noticed it. She got in the car because at that point my mom was ready to confront her and reached into her purse where she kept a pocket knife. But they drove away, and right after they did, my mom looked at me and just burst into tears saying, "I almost lost you." My mom knew full well what was happening, and I was still too shaken to say anything. I just hugged her and we went home. I was still in denial, and to cope, I convinced myself that maybe I wasn't in any real danger. My family, of course, never kept in contact with any of them, but my stepdad at the time submitted a tip to the police about the incident. When they caught up with him about 3 months later, we found out he was arrested for having illegal material on his computer. They found restraints in his closet as well as containers of propofol. They found pictures of me from my mom's Facebook downloaded on his computer too, leading them to believe that I was actually being watched for a while. I never liked talking about it because, to this day, if I hadn't stopped for those 10 seconds to ask the woman to call my mom, I don't know where I'd be, or if I'd even be alive right now to share this. While it may seem like something that would have easily been forgotten, it was never the case for me. I haven't even told my closest friends this story, but I might sometime soon. I asked my mom what happened that night, why she came looking for me. She described the same feeling I remembered feeling moments before I was almost abducted, just a lot sooner than I did. She just had the instinct that I was in danger. I'm not usually a lucky person. It seems like the odds are always against me. But I always remember how lucky I was that night, that my mom decided to listen to her instincts when I didn't. I've never ignored my instincts since. And every night after that, when I finally did decide to leave the house again, my mom would walk with me, all the way up until I turned 13 and went to live with my dad. And that, to date, is the scariest thing I've ever experienced. It's the kind of thing you only hear about on the news, and nobody ever thinks it will happen to them. But my life was a mere 20 seconds from being completely different. Story 13. Not as scary as some of the other stories here, but a good cautionary tale for those who never experienced a dictatorship. My father was in his last year of high school. Brazil's dictatorship period of 1964 had started a few years before. One day, 2 soldiers came into the class, grabbed one of my father's classmates by the arm, and took him out. Neither the classmate nor his family were ever seen again. No explanation, no warrant, no process. They just vanished. My father and his brother told us stories of the spies who would appear at times in schools and universities. Random students who would sit in for a couple of classes, sometimes even befriending classmates if they stayed longer. When those students stopped coming, usually another real student would disappear too. When the military government issued what is called Institutional Act Number 5, it suspended basically every civil right, and the military could just enter people's houses, search whatever they wanted, take whatever and whoever they wanted, and leave. No explanations needed. People were tortured and killed to save the country from communism, which was never a real threat to begin with. Story 14. My grandpa and his hunting buddy were out moose hunting years ago, when my mom was still a kid. They were about an hour into a hike, looking for a big bull, when they decided to split up to cover more ground. My grandpa, after about 15 to 20 minutes of walking through dense brush, came into a small clearing of trees and a mama grizzly and her 2 cubs. Almost instinctively, my grandpa scrambled up the closest tree, just out of the angry mama bear's reach, even kicking at her snout a few times. After circling and scratching at the tree he was in, mama bear ambled off into the brush, her cubs right behind her. When he thought he was in the clear, he started climbing down, but a crashing from the same bushes mama bear walked into made him go straight back up the tree. She must have seen him trying to climb down, because she charged right back at him, now furiously snapping at his feet and shaking the tree. Again, after circling the tree and growling up a storm, she left a second time. And again, my grandpa waited, but a little longer. He managed to carefully make his way down and sort of speed-walked in the direction where he and his buddy had parked their truck. Mama Bear had definitely been watching, because as soon as he was almost out of the clearing, she came charging out once more. He quickly shot up another tree, this time a little higher up than his previous safe spot. After a good long while of her snarling, shaking and scratching the tree, and overall terrorizing my grandpa, she left, this time a little faster. My grandpa was in that tree for what seemed like forever, listening carefully for any movement. After about half an hour, he slowly made his way down the tree, pausing every so often to make sure Mama Bear wasn't just peeking over the brush, waiting for him. After making it to the ground and checking to see if the coast was clear, my grandpa made a quick but quiet getaway back to the truck, where his hunting buddy was waiting, equally empty-handed. When questioned why he didn't bring anything back, my grandpa explained he just had a run-in with the world's most persistent mother bear. That was explanation enough. Story 15. The events surrounding the father and son who built submarines and explored the bottom of Lake Tahoe. It's pretty widely known that it's one of the deepest lakes in the world, and at the bottom, a combination of almost freezing cold water and low oxygen keeps things preserved for a very long time. There are underwater tunnels that reach between Lake Tahoe and other smaller lakes, and things will get trapped in pockets of the tunnels and whatnot. There are reports and pictures of fully preserved Native American remains and gangsters in pinstripe suits and enormous grizzly bears. It gets creepy because there is another lake in the area which has 2 names. One name is the official one, which I'm not sure of, and the other is Dead Baby Lake. This is because the local native tribes would bury young deceased infants in the lake, hoping their spirits would live on. Anyways, when the father and son reached the bottom of the lake, in their submersible, they recorded footage of what they saw. Upon resurfacing, though, they were both very visibly disturbed and wouldn't talk or show evidence of what they'd seen. They locked the video away and proclaimed that the world isn't ready to see the things they had captured. Story 16. My girl and I were flying into her hometown after traveling around the country for Thanksgiving. It was a few days earlier than scheduled, so we didn't tell any of her family, or mine, who also flew in, because we'd been spending Thanksgiving together for the last few years. We honestly didn't utter a word. This was back in 1992, so there were no cell phones, no tracking abilities, or any of that. Anyway, we got into town late at night, around 11 p.m. or midnight. We had decided to stay in a hotel since the plan was to surprise the family, and while showing up on their doorstep late at night would have certainly surprised them, that wasn't the kind we were going for. We got into our room. It had a kitchenette, a couch, a TV, a king bed. It was probably one of the nicer places we'd stayed in. I passed out immediately. She took a shower. From what she told me, she lay in bed, unable to sleep, until about 2 a.m. For context, we were in an extended stay hotel with a door that led right out into the parking lot. There was a sliding glass door to the left of the bed. Straight ahead was the couch, the door, a desk, and a smaller window. The blinds were shut on the sliding glass door, but on the smaller window, I guess they were open a crack. When she realized this, she was so tired, she didn't care all that much. Our room was completely dark, so it wasn't really like anybody could see in. At least that was the logic. As she turned over to go to sleep at 2 a.m., through the slightly open blinds at the smaller window, she saw a flash, like a camera flash. But because the parking lot was 50 steps away, she simply assumed that it was a street light and didn't think anything of it before falling asleep. At 5 a.m., I was woken up by loud knocking on the sliding glass door. She woke up only a few seconds after I did and was just as confused and disoriented as I was. Continuous, persistent knocking. I had half a mind to assume it was some drunk guest. It was the holidays, after all, who had made a wrong turn while trying to get back to their room. The knocking stopped briefly, then started on the front door. I want to emphasize how this knocking sounded. Not quite a police knock, but someone was clearly determined to get into this room and wasn't going to stop. I went to the door to look through the peephole, and I didn't see anybody. The knocking started again on the sliding glass door. If it were someone trying to wake up a friend they got separated from, wouldn't they be calling their name? Wouldn't they be identifying themselves? Like I said, the knock wasn't a cop knock, so I knew it wasn't them. They'd have announced their presence. I went back to the sliding glass door and stood there. The knocking persisted. Once it stopped, I peeled the curtain back just enough to see out. I'm pretty blind without contacts and didn't have my glasses on, so I had to press my face right up to the glass, and I saw nobody. The second I shut the blinds, the knocking started again. At this point, I was freaked out. I was trying to stay calm so my girlfriend wouldn't panic, but we were already both past that point. Nobody knew we were here. No friends, no family. The only person who knew was the older man who checked us in. And why would he care? I started to get genuinely concerned for our safety. If whoever was outside managed to get in and had bad intentions, I was at a disadvantage. I'm a small guy, 5 feet 8 inches, 125 pounds soaking wet. I can talk tough and throw a punch, but if someone bigger wanted to hurt me, it wouldn't be hard. I called the front desk while the knocking continued. On the second ring, the man who checked us in answered, and I explained the situation. He said he'd send the security guard over to check it out. The knocking continued for about another minute. Not even 2 or 3 minutes after it stopped, I got a call back. The front desk said security didn't see anybody, didn't find any signs of anyone, but apologized for what had happened. Super comforting. Neither of us fell back asleep until it was light out. Later that day, when we went outside, we noticed a single footprint leading away from the sliding glass door. Weird, because we were in a nice part of town. It was a place she grew up in and felt safe knowing the area well. That was one of the reasons we chose to stay there. It was horrible. We're still stumped as to what really happened. I don't know. I still get uncomfortable just thinking about it, really. Story 17. I have twice in my life encountered something I cannot identify, which has been described to me as a Wendigo. I was out backcountry camping, not terribly far out, but far enough off the beaten path that I know there were no people within 5 kilometers. For the record, no drugs or alcohol, not overly tired, and if it had only happened once in my life, I would have written it off as a dream or misremembered memory. Got a little thirsty late at night, cleared out my water bottle and figured I'd walk down to the nearby river, fill my bottle so the chlorine tablets could do their job overnight, and I'd have water in the morning. Maybe a 5-minute hike from my camp. There by the water, lit only by the moon, was an animal. My flashlight was pointed at my feet so I wouldn't trip. It had 4 legs and appeared dark, black. I was going through the list in my head, too thin for a black bear. Couldn't think of anything else that'd be that dark. And then it stood up. I can only describe it as a muscular coyote with no fur, black skin, long arms, and judging by the trees it was standing near, about 7 feet tall. It looked at me. I looked at it. That was not a coyote. It was not a bear. I don't know what it was, but I sure wasn't going to find out in the middle of the night. I kept facing it, backed away slowly until I was out of line of sight, got back to my camp, packed up my things and left. Some years later, and about 1,000 kilometers away, I had a second encounter. Late at night, I was walking down a dirt service road near a farm. A head popped up out of the wheat and looked at me. I recognized that shape. It wasn't looking at me. I shouted, "Hey, don't mind me, I'm just going that way." It looked at me. The head disappeared into the wheat. I left immediately. I don't know what I saw. It doesn't match anything I've ever seen. I've since had the chance to speak to some people about it. The answer I usually get is a wolf or coyote with mange. No way. The ears were wrong, and those arms were too long, aside from the way it stood. I don't claim it was supernatural or some undiscovered cryptid, but I don't go walking in the moonlight in the backcountry of the Rockies anymore. Story 18. My personal scariest was in 2013. I was driving about 40 or 50 feet behind this red truck at midnight. This was a decently long bridge that peaks in the middle, about 3/4 of a mile on either side. The roads on either end are also straight for another full mile, open with no turnoffs or exits. When you're at the middle of the bridge, you can see about 2 miles in either direction. I was following this truck, just jamming to my music, headed home from my girlfriend's house. For some reason, right before the red truck crested the top, I got a weird feeling in my gut, like when you're on a roller coaster. The truck passed the peak, and from my point of view, you can't see anything past the peak until you get over it. About 4 to 5 seconds later, I reached the peak, and the truck was completely gone. I looked down the long stretch of road, and there wasn't a single vehicle. Even if it had been a supercar flooring it, there's no way it would have been out of my view that fast. I tried looking it up to see if a red truck had ever driven off that bridge, but never found anything. To this day, I'm not sure what happened, but I can clearly remember that red Ford Ranger. Story 19. A couple of friends of mine had a horrific honeymoon experience. They took their honeymoon at a resort in Mexico. It wasn't super high-end, but was nice enough for them, as they weren't very well off and paid for it themselves. Their first night, they went down to a resort bar on the beach. The husband had a couple of drinks, and the wife was sipping on her first. It wasn't long before she began acting very intoxicated, and he, not being a stranger to drinking, was starting to feel way more drunk than he should have based on how much he had. They both began to feel uneasy, so they decided to head up to their room early. He was woken up hours later by his wife, who was hysterical. They were both completely naked and on the floor. No memory of how either of them ended up that way, or even making it back to their room. Their room had been ransacked, and all their cash and credit cards were gone. They both felt like they had the worst hangovers in the world, and now they had no money and they were in another country. They frantically began calling family and friends, but had trouble reaching anyone because it was so early in the morning. They eventually got a hold of some mutual friends of ours and explained what happened. They managed to get some money sent to them, but had some hurdles because of the lack of cards. Thankfully, they both made it back. Still no memory of what happened after they left the bar. It shook them both up really badly, and they don't like to talk about it. Story 20. My father was a Vietnam veteran, and he never really talked about the war to us. You could tell it was painful for him. As he got older, he became really sick, and the VA doctors said that it was all due to him being exposed to Agent Orange while in Vietnam. He passed away almost 8 years ago at age 68. He was getting full compensation from the VA for his disability, and one way for him to get the money was to see a psychiatrist. I took him to his appointment, and he asked me to go in with him for support. The psychiatrist asked him to talk about his time in Vietnam, and one story he told that broke him down into tears was about a friend of his. Soldiers were told that if they were sleeping and heard sirens, indicating bombs were about to be dropped, they needed to try and cover themselves with whatever they had that might be substantial. My father and his friend were sleeping, and the sirens went off. My dad woke and threw whatever he had on top of himself, and luckily, that saved his life. When the bombing stopped, my dad came out from underneath and saw that his friend never took cover due to sleeping through the sirens, and he was decapitated. I will never forget that story. Story 21. Was out in California with my wife and daughter. She was about 10 months old at the time, visiting my father-in-law. We drove into the city to hang out. He had to handle a traffic ticket, so we drove to the courthouse. As we drive in, this car is entering the lot. There was a gate with a guard. Not driving super fast, but too fast for a parking lot. The attendant seemed to be running after the car. We were super confused. The car proceeds to drive into the lot, picks up even more speed, and then the passenger, a woman, opens the door and falls out of the car. We stop our car. We're not in the lot yet, and we're all wondering what is going on. The car stops. The driver hops out and starts chasing the woman. Then all hell breaks loose. She's screaming. He's chasing her. The lot attendant is close behind him. And then I notice the driver chasing her has a knife. The woman runs toward the courthouse up the steps and the driver catches up. Courthouse police are running toward them now. 3 of them, guns drawn, yelling at them to stop. The driver tackles the woman. Remember, he has a knife. And as they struggle on the ground, we hear 4 to 5 gunshots. I could have sworn they just hit both of them, but the woman jumps up and is quickly ushered into the courthouse by one of the cops. The other 2 approach the man, guns still drawn, and he writhes around a bit, then goes still. My wife didn't think they were real gunshots. She thought they were beanbags or something. Thankfully, my daughter was in a rear-facing car seat and had no idea what was going on. We turned around and left. News later reported the woman was being physically abused by the man, but she convinced him to take her to the courthouse to deal with a speeding ticket or something. She took her chance to get away. He chased her with a knife, and the courthouse cops shot and killed him. I was incredibly impressed that they fired into this tangle of 2 people and the woman wasn't injured. Still doesn't feel totally real that I watched those cops shoot and kill that guy. Story 22. Grew up watching scary movies Sunday mornings after church with my dad. At night, my imagination flourished with boogeymen and whatnot waiting for me to peek at them. I kept my eyes shut, trying not to look like I was deliberately keeping them shut. Prayed in my head, sang church songs in my head, anything not to look until I finally fell asleep. Freshman year of high school, we moved to a newer and bigger house. I remember being reassured by the scriptures painted on the tile in the kitchen and bathrooms. I just knew that a house built by a pastor wasn't buried on an indigenous burial ground, the site of a murder or some other horrendous crime. I think I sensed something and tried rationalizing it. All 4 bedrooms shared a hallway, 3 doors opening into it at one end, and the master bedroom opening to it at the other. I woke up in the middle of the night and peeked out, just knowing there wouldn't be anything. In the corner opposite my open door was a shadow that was somehow darker than the rest of the darkened hallway. And I knew it was watching me. And I knew it knew I saw it. And I made out a tall, slender figure in a top hat before I was under my covers. Eyes screwed shut, praying in my head and singing all the songs I knew. Absolutely refusing to move a muscle until I eventually passed out. Decades later, my younger brother and I were reminiscing about our childhood. My husband told me to tell my brother about the shadow in the top hat. My brother paled and described the shadow before I could say anything else. It freaked me out even more. Hundreds of miles and years away, knowing the other times I saw it in the corner weren't the only times it had been there. Story 23. A few years ago, I came home to find the front door of my house was ajar. My housemate at the time had such a bad habit of not locking up, so I just thought it was a new level of that and got annoyed. Some background relevant to the story. The front door opened right into the living room, and the house itself was tiny. Downstairs was just the living room and kitchen, which was a small space directly off the living room and to the right of the front door. Opposite the front door in the living room were French doors that opened into the back garden. Upstairs, there were just 2 rooms and a bathroom. So after finding the door ajar, I went in, but nothing looked out of place. My housemate's MacBook was on the couch. There were car keys on the window ledge by the front door, and there was some cash and an ATM card on the coffee table. I didn't suspect anything because all the valuables were there, so I didn't think much of it. Still, because the door had been open for who knows how long, I went upstairs to check the rooms to see if the neighbor's cat had come in. He loved coming over to sleep. While I was upstairs, I heard someone running across the living room and violently throwing the French doors open. Stupidly, I ran down to check what was happening, still not thinking anything serious was going on. I got down in time to see a guy in the garden jumping over the back fence, which was quite high. I locked the doors, calmed myself down, and laughed off the near miss of interrupting a home intruder. I went into the kitchen to make some tea. All the cupboards and drawers were open. He had rummaged through everything, and all the sharp knives, including an entire knife set and wooden block, were gone. It took me a few minutes to realize that this guy, the one who had just helped himself to all the sharp knives, had been waiting in the kitchen the entire time I was downstairs. The kitchen was only about 10 feet from the door, and he would have had to run past me to get to either the French doors or the front door to get out. It was scary to think that if I hadn't gone upstairs to check for the cat, I'd probably have come face to face with him in the very, very small kitchen. Story 24. I was driving home from visiting a friend who lives several hours away from me. 6 hours to be exact. I hadn't seen my friend in a very long time, and instead of leaving early from my visit like I should have, I left their place around 8 p.m. I messaged my husband when I left and told him not to wait up for me, as I wouldn't be home until almost 3 a.m. We said goodnight, and he told me to drive safely. The highways I take to get home aren't major thoroughfares. I live in rural Canada, so 90% of my drive would be on small 2-lane highways. It's actually a beautiful drive through gorgeous countryside. So I'm into my drive about 4 hours when things get weird. I'm literally in the middle of nowhere when my GPS starts acting up. After about 5 minutes, it literally just dies on me. No problem though, I'll just use my phone. No sooner do I load the directions on my phone, and it starts acting up too. Screen flashing on and off, the coordinates spinning. Really weird stuff. Then just like the GPS, it dies. Still not a huge deal. I'm only a couple of hours from home. I can find my way. So I turn on the radio. I had been listening to music on my phone, but it was now dead. Normally, at this distance from the city, you can still pick up a station or two. But nothing. Just really weird static. It was the most beautiful, calm, clear summer night, and the stars are so vivid when you're out of the city. But literally, out of nowhere, this weird green fog started to appear. As I continued driving, the fog got thicker, to the point where I was only going about 40 kilometers per hour. On a highway, I was just doing 120 on. Then out of nowhere, my car died while I was driving. I drive a standard, so I threw it in neutral to coast as far as possible. When I finally came to a complete stop, the fog was so thick, it was actually inside the car. I could barely see my hands on the steering wheel, and it had a terrible taste. Next thing I know, it's daylight out, and I'm being yelled at by 2 CN workers. I was still in a daze. It was almost like I was frozen. The workers were screaming at me. I guess my car was parked on private railroad property. They asked how I got past security with my car. Why was I there? I couldn't answer. I literally had no idea where I was. They told me to leave before they called the cops and filed trespassing charges. I tried to explain what happened. I told them the car died on the side of the highway. I went to start the car to show them it was dead, and after some heavy hesitation, it finally started. I couldn't believe where I was. I was literally inside a CN rail yard. How did I get here? There was a 9-foot fence surrounding the compound and a locked security gate at the front. I asked the worker where I was, and when he told me, I was in disbelief. I was at least 100 kilometers from where I last remembered. As I was driving out, I instantly remembered my husband. He must be worried sick. What time was it? How did I get here? My phone was still completely dead, so I couldn't message him. When I finally got home, it was 3 p.m. I tried to explain what happened to my husband, and he was in total disbelief. We both were. The next day, I went to the phone store to see if my phone could be fixed. They said it might take a week or so, but it was repairable. The very next day, I noticed something was wrong. I felt awful. My hair started falling out, and I developed a really bad rash. So we went to the hospital. I told them what had happened a couple of days earlier, and they thought I was joking. It wasn't until my blood work came back an hour later that they took me seriously. I had radiation poisoning. They immediately put me in an isolation room. I spent a total of 21 days in the hospital before I was deemed non-radioactive. And when I got my phone back from the cell phone company, the last time my GPS pinged, it said I was 4,000 feet in the air. Story 25. I worked as a house cleaner in Minneapolis for most of 2019. One of my clients was a mom with 2 kids. They lived in an old house that they kept pretty tidy, but I always got a sad, rundown feeling when I did my cleans. I think it was mostly due to being an old creaky house that I'm sure many people had lived in over the years, but it also had the look of being hastily furnished with mismatched secondhand goods. The mom was very mild-mannered and soft-spoken. She had a quiet confidence about her and just seemed like a gentle soul. Most of the times I cleaned, she was in her room on work calls, but occasionally I was left in the house alone. Her boys had Pokemon bedsheets and so many books strewn about their room. I didn't interact with the boys much, but they seemed like goofy, normal kids with a caring, hard-working mom. During one clean, I was tidying up their living room, which had a desk in it. The desk was covered in papers, and I decided to stack them so I could dust off the table. The papers on top of the pile were from the woman's lawyer, detailing finalized divorce proceedings. I did not read much further, but I learned that she was now separated from her husband. I left the cleaning company that fall and moved on to other work, eventually leaving Minneapolis in fall of 2020 to move in with my parents in Virginia. That December, I got an email from a massage therapist I regularly saw back in Minneapolis, whose mailing list I'd forgotten to unsubscribe from. She said she was taking time off work as the boyfriend of her child had been shot and murdered. She included a link to a database for people who had been the victims of gun violence in the Twin Cities. My morbid curiosity got the best of me, and I started scrolling through and reading about the people listed. About 20 minutes in, after clicking to the next page, I was startled to see pictures of the woman I used to clean for, as well as pictures of her 2 children. I Googled her name and learned that in early December of 2019, her ex-husband had come to her house to pick up the boys, as usual, but this time he brought a gun. The kids ran out to meet him, excited for their time together, and then realized he was armed and tried to run away. He shot both boys in the front yard multiple times, in the middle of the day, in front of neighbors. He then went inside and shot and stabbed their mom before shooting and killing himself. He allegedly left a note, but it has not been publicly released. I cannot claim to have really known this woman and her kids, but it is a strange feeling to be intimately familiar with a family's home and belongings, and to then learn they all had been murdered at that home by someone so closely linked to them. Suffice it to say that I've spent a lot of time since learning about their murder, reading about family annihilation, and trying to understand how people can get to the point where they feel that is the right and necessary thing to do. I wish her family as much peace as is possible to feel after something so incomprehensible and violent. Story 26. I was at the principal's office. This was 1990 or 1991, and this random guy walked in. He was well-dressed and driving a black town car. He asked for this super popular girl by name and said her dad sent him to pick her up from his office. The girl was a cheerleader and athlete and was known locally by a lot of people. The secretary told the guy to wait in his car and she'd call for the girl and send her out. The guy left and the vice principal was sitting there. He casually walked up to the secretary and quietly told her to call the police. She asked why, and he said the girl's dad died 2 years ago, so that guy had to be up to something. Then he just walked off like nothing happened. I was sitting there enthralled but also in trouble, so I kept my head down. The secretary called the police and then told the VP they'd be there in 10 minutes. He said okay, walked out to the guy's car, and they started chatting. Then they both walked back in and went to his office, and he asked the secretary to bring them coffee. They were just laughing and talking. At that point, I got called into the principal's office and got in trouble for being a little troublemaker. When I left, the guy was gone, but his car was still parked out front. When I asked the secretary what happened, she just told me to go back to class. I wasn't cool enough to talk to the girl, so I never found out what happened. Story 27. I lived in Germany for a couple of years and met several folks with remarkable and heartbreaking stories. Here are 2 that frequently come to mind. One woman survived Auschwitz. She was pregnant in high school in Berlin toward the end of the war, and her teacher told everyone they would be working periodically in the munitions factory as a form of community service. My friend made a joke to the effect of, "Well, I'm not making guns for Hitler." She found out she had been reported to the Gestapo, so she ran away to her relatives near Dresden, where she gave birth to her daughter. To keep the Gestapo from finding her baby, she returned to Berlin, where she was caught and sent to Auschwitz as a political dissident. While there, she was assaulted almost daily by the guards and had several miscarriages. Dr. Joseph Mengele performed a hysterectomy. She described it as him ripping out her uterus to prevent her from getting pregnant again, but then turned her back over to the guards for continued abuse. She survived until the Auschwitz liberation in January 1945, at which point she was passed between different Allied armed forces who didn't know what to do with her. She eventually got back home to Berlin, but wasn't reunited with her daughter until the early 1950s, since finding family members had become its own nightmare. Another man I knew served compulsory time as a soldier during the Cold War. He was stationed on the Berlin Wall and one night witnessed a man sprinting across no man's land, trying to get to Western Berlin. My friend had no love for the communists and was going to let the man escape, but his commanding officer saw the man too. The officer ran up to my friend and screamed in his face to raise his rifle and shoot the man. When my friend didn't move, the commanding officer pulled out his pistol, leveled it at his head and threatened, "You shoot him right now or I'll kill you." My friend, all 5 feet 2 inches of him, turned to his officer, threw his rifle in his face and yelled, If you want him dead, you shoot him. Fortunately, his officer was more bark than bite and backed off. My friend was later punished, but both he and the fleeing man survived. Story 28. This isn't a gory crime story, but it still makes my mom cry to tell it, and I can confirm it's true because it happened to me. I went to lower school in a town rural enough that houses were spaced pretty far apart, and there were absolutely no sidewalks to speak of. Everyone knew our usual bus driver by name. For context, I started kindergarten at around 5 years old, and I was a tiny kid, probably not even 40 pounds soaking wet. One day in the middle of winter, we were driven home by a substitute school bus driver who wasn't familiar with our route. Usually, I was dropped off directly in front of my house, probably 50 feet maximum from my front door. On this day, the substitute accidentally blew past at least 5 bus stops and then stopped a few miles down the road, where she promptly ordered 30 kids aged 5 to 10 to get off the bus. There had been a line of very frustrated parents driving behind us, aware that the bus driver had missed their children's stops, so most kids were promptly picked up where she made us get out. Not me. 5 years old, alone on the side of the road, in the middle of winter, my house was miles away. One of the older boys who attended my school stuck around with his dad until all of the other parents and kids had left, along with the school bus. I remember the dad saying to his son that he couldn't leave me there, but I got the impression he was afraid of getting in trouble if he put me in his car. I couldn't have identified his son by name, but he was vaguely familiar in the way that you sort of recognize someone you've seen before. Eventually, the dad buckled me into the back of his car, and his son gave directions back to my house. There was more nervous discussion in my driveway, and then the dad let me out of his car and waited until I walked inside before he drove away. My parents didn't know what had happened until years later, that at 5 years old, their daughter had willingly gotten into the car of a man she didn't know. My mom has always said that if she had known that bus driver left a 5-year-old on the side of the road in the dead of winter, she would have raised hell. So many bad things could have happened to me that day, including being struck by a car, harmed by the weather, or worse. I have no idea who that nervous dad was, but I'm grateful to him and his son. Story 29. One night, a husband and wife were in their first-floor condo, sound asleep in their bedroom. The wife heard a noise that was loud enough to wake her up. She thought at first it was just one of those noises and probably nothing. Nevertheless, she lay very still and listened carefully to see if it was anything. Sure enough, she heard someone going through their condo. She shook her husband awake and immediately put her fingers to her lips when he woke up. She whispered to him that someone was in the condo. The husband crawled out of bed and went out to the living room and shouted, "I know you're in here, so just get out!" The intruder didn't leave, but instead came at the husband and began to fight him. The husband was very strong. He had a physical job and very powerful hands. Still, the intruder fought back and wouldn't stop. The husband continued trying to convince the intruder to leave. He refused. The wife was still in the bedroom with 911 on the line at this point. The husband finally got the intruder into a chokehold. He could feel the breath going out of the guy and realized that if he continued, he might end his life. Not wanting to hurt anyone, he began to ease up. Once the intruder could breathe again, he reached into his boot, pulled out a knife, and stabbed the husband in the chest. The intruder then ran into the bedroom where the wife was, grabbed her purse, and fled the scene. The husband returned to the bedroom, completely pale, with blood pouring from his chest as he clutched the wound. Emergency services arrived shortly after and rushed him to the hospital, where emergency surgery took place immediately. The intruder had punctured the husband's lung, and he came dangerously close to not surviving. The question remains, in a moment like that, fight or flight, what would you do? Story 30. I used to see a girl. Let's call her Amanda. Amanda had dated an ex-convict. He went to prison because his girlfriend of 8 months cheated on him, so he went to the guy's house, tied him up, beat him severely, and allegedly tried to get him to harm himself before the police arrived. It didn't work, and he got caught. You might think that's the scary story, but it's not. While Amanda and this ex-con were dating on and off because of their toxic relationship, Amanda would party with me and my friends. At one of the parties, which I didn't attend and I do not regret it, Amanda was assaulted by a vague acquaintance, if we can even call him that. After that party, the guy went missing. Not officially at first, just nobody heard from him ever again. Fast forward a couple of months and we realized he had officially gone missing and police were now looking for him. In a conversation with Amanda, I brought it up, and she looked at me in a strange way. In that moment, I more or less understood what had happened, without her saying a word. We stopped hooking up, and I cut her off after that. I never wanted to know about any violent acts, let alone be associated with someone whose ex had an extreme past. She also freebased substances, so there was that too. In retrospect, I think I was trying to save her, but there is no saving someone like that. Story 31. I was forgetful and just plain absent-minded. I started college and locked myself out of the car for the millionth time. I didn't want to call my dad. For obvious reasons, I felt like a total fool. I realized my phone was also in my backpack, which was in the car. No problem. I'd just head into school and call from there. A man in his vehicle saw me and offered to call someone for me. He dialed the number and just stared at me. I suddenly became very aware of the L shape of the parking lot I was in and how I was in the back with only one way out. He looked over and I saw two other guys walking toward us. He was clearly on the phone with one of them. I tried to play it cool and said, "Wrong number, huh?" He smirked. My brain was screaming at my stupidity. By some miracle, I saw a familiar vehicle flash its lights. It was my dad. I had also forgotten my laptop charger, and he had been trying to call me. He thought, "I bet my kid locked herself out while trying to pay that parking ticket." I started crying. I moved to get away, and one of the guys stepped into my path. My dad rolled up, inches from hitting the men on foot. He rolled down his window and started calmly describing them aloud. Two Caucasian men, both wearing blue sweaters, third man in the truck. They got scared and scrambled toward the truck. But remember, there was only one way out. I jumped into my dad's car. Literally seconds later, a campus officer came by. A girl who had been with me while I was grabbing the ticket noticed I wasn't walking behind her afterward and had asked them to check if I needed help. I don't know what kind of guardian angel situation that was, but I've never been so grateful. Story 32. For my birthday, my boyfriend wanted to take me out to a place at the Arizona River that has always been my favorite spot. My best friend was dating one of his friends, so they came along too, as did a few others, but they were in separate cars. I live in California, so those familiar know about that one long, isolated road that leads you in and out of Arizona from Cali. On the day we left to head back home, my friend was driving, I was in the passenger seat, and the boys were in the back. I was vibing, half asleep because I don't sleep well in hotels and we'd been there for the last 5 days or so. Something happened to my friend's car. It broke down, and we had to call the police so they could send a tow truck since we had no cell service. We were about 3 hours into the drive and in the middle of nowhere, so we knew we'd be waiting a long time. At about dusk, my friend and her boyfriend were asleep in the back seat. My boyfriend and I were sitting in the trunk, just relaxing. Suddenly, in the near distance, we saw 3 people walking by. There was no car around that could have dropped them off, and we had no idea where they came from. It was almost like they just appeared. We didn't think too much of it. The desert has its share of strange wanderers, but it still weirded me out a bit. An hour later, it was dark, and those same people walked by again, heading in the opposite direction. But now there were only 2 of them. We didn't hear anything suspicious, but we had no clue what happened to the third person. It's not like we were in the middle of a city. They didn't have anywhere to take him. Just endless desert on both sides. It's always stuck with me as something eerie. We watched them until they disappeared out of sight. Same road, several years earlier. I was with my mom, dad, and a friend of theirs who were serious rockhounds, so we spent a lot of time in the desert. There's a section of that drive that's very hilly, not enormous hills, but big enough that when a car goes over one, you can't see it anymore. It was dark, and my parents were probably exhausted from being in the sun all day. As we were driving, we suddenly saw a man riding his bike, going up and down the hills just as we were. A reminder, we're in the middle of the desert, hundreds of miles from the nearest town. Seeing someone on a bike, riding like he was in a neighborhood, was strange. We watched him for a long time, until he went over one hill and never appeared again. He literally vanished. I don't know where he could have gone without someone in the car seeing him,